it's great to be here to look at a few of the books from the archive. There's such an amazing collection, and to be able to sort of handle them and browse through them as part of the research was so important. The ones we've got here at the moment are a bit of a selection over the last century, and they tell a bit of a story of the evolution of the press, the growing sophistication of formats and styles and editorial conventions, and it all kind of starts with a really sort of quite an unpromising first publication, which was the Willard History of the White Australia policy. And you can see that it was done in pretty sort of brittle, flimsy wrappers, a paper cover, 10 years before Penguin launched their paperbacks, more than 10 years before Penguin paperbacks, MUP was issuing books like this in paper. But it's a pretty sort of unattractive, brittle sort of cover, and it says very, very importantly, University of Melbourne publication #1 on the cover, but there's not really any kind of investment in style or aesthetics or sort of editorial conventions. And a good example of that is the full stop behind the biography there, the full stop behind #1. These are all the things that the press would quickly learn about. This particular copy is water stained and pretty roughly handled. It's had a long life over the last 100 years. I actually found this sort of stuffed away somewhere at the back of a bottom shelf behind a filing cabinet and a photocopy machine, and it is a very, very important book in the history of the press. So that's the sort of starting point, but very, very quickly within the first decade, the press was producing books in much more substantial formats and with much more of a resemblance to the best trade publishing from that period. So this is Roberts' History of Land Settlement from 1924, so it's only a couple of years after the Willard, and it's in a handsome buckram cloth binding, very trade and very, very authoritative looking binding, much more sophisticated typography, illustrations, much more conventional half title, title page and imprint page. And I would say that the publications from that first decade would match the best from other academic publishers and from the best trade publishers. They were adopting the same kinds of conventions, the same kinds of formats. Fast forward a little bit to the middle of the century, and books around this sort of period, so in the 1950s and the 1960s, even when they were purely published by MUP, they were distributed through an arrangement with Cambridge University Press. And now that arrangement and the earlier collaboration with OUP gave MUP infinite book world credibility, and it brought with it, in particular, this small line of words at the bottom of the imprint page: London and New York, Cambridge University Press. So even though the book's solely published by MUP, because of that distribution arrangement, which was mainly focused on the UK and the US, MUP publications had those powerful words: London and New York, Cambridge University Press. So that was a really important milestone period. And along the way, MUP obviously were producing scholarly books, and they were producing academic monographs and all sorts of other, the sorts of things you'd expect to see from a university press. But there's all sorts of other anomalies and outliers along the way as well. Fernley Morris is the pseudonym of Frank Wilmot, who was the head of the press in the 1930s. And before he was at MUP, he'd written a children's book, The Bay and Paddy book. And this book and a lot of other Frank Wilmot aka Fernley Morris titles, were also issued by MUP when he was here. And this turned out to be one of the best-selling books in the history of the press. Through the century, the press has experimented with fine printed books and limited editions. And an example of that is a series of books that the press did with Norman Lindsay while he was alive and after he passed away, which were very much in that fine press special editions market, and they sold very, very quickly, and they're now collector's items. And one final book that I wanted to pull out, mostly under the Magunya imprint, and towards the end of the 20th century and the start of the 21st century, the press built a strength in Pacificana, travel journals, histories of the British and French excursions into the Pacific, and Ray Parkin's book on the Endeavour is a really good example of the sort of unexpected successes of those books. This was done as a hefty 2-volume book in a slipcase, relatively high cost, relatively low expectations about how that would go in the market, but it went spectacularly well. It went into multiple printings. There was a single volume edition done afterward, and even a paperback edition as a Magunya title as well. So that's an example of a bit of entrepreneurship in the press, and that blending of scholarly content, commercial content or commercial presentation, but also fine printing and high quality production.